All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is Carson Holloway. I'm the chairman of the Political Science Department. I'm also the director of the Constitutional Studies Forum, which is a speaker series we have here at the university, supported by the generous contributions of the Jack Miller Center, who I want to acknowledge and thank. And also it's an initiative within the Political Science Department. And I want to thank Mr. Hebrink too for encouraging students to attend this excellent lecture that we're about to hear. The lecture is on the topic Politics, Philosophy, and the Origins of Modern Science. I've been thinking about that topic a lot since I set it up with our speaker, and I was just going to introduce it to you in this way. You all know, simply from living in our society, that science has tremendous authority in our regime or in our society. I've seen that over the course of my life, which is longer than many of yours. But we've also seen it more recently, like with the pandemic. The appeals to the authority of science were obvious in that crisis and made by many people. But if you study the past, as I often am called to do by my teaching, you go back far enough, you see that science didn't have much of any authority in society. Science was something done by a few isolated scholars because they were interested in it, but social authority was really held more by religion and by religious authorities, clerics. So how do we get from there to here? We could only transform the sources of authority in our society because some people took the trouble to think about that question and to make arguments and to take actions designed to transform the sources of authority in our society. And one of those people is Descartes, who's the philosopher that's going to be the subject of our talk. Let me introduce our speaker now that I've introduced the topic. Our guest is Arthur Milikh. Mr. Milikh is the executive director of the Claremont Institute's Center for the American Way of Life. He was previously the associate director for the Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, he worked for the House Committee on Armed Services and at the Hudson Institute. His writings have appeared in the Claremont Review of Books, National Affairs, City Journal, and Real Clear Politics. He holds a BA from Emory University, a master's degree from the University of Chicago, and he is in the process of completing his PhD in philosophy at Catholic University of America. So let's welcome him without further ado. Take it away. Leave time for questions.
Yeah. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. It's nice to meet you. It's always a pleasure to see Carson, whom I've known for a very long time. We've been colleagues, which has been, one of the pleasures of life is to have good friends and to work with them. We have a very hefty topic. Professor Holloway summarized it: politics, philosophy, and the origins of modern science. So in 1 hour, you can imagine we can just scratch the surface. And I'm not even sure that I'm competent to address that enormous theme. I mean, this is a lifetime of work to really get to the bottom of things. So I can't promise to take you very far, but the way to do it, the way to start to understand it, is to look at the root, the origins of why we have the society that we have, that is based in authority in science, the scientific method, and the fruits of modern natural science. And the best way to do that is through the thought of Rene Descartes. So he wrote a book called Discourse on Method. Have you guys heard of Descartes? Okay, have you guys read him? Okay, good. One. So that's quite normal, as I'll explain in a moment. It's a tiny book. I mean, look at it. It's tiny. It's less than 160 pages. And it absolutely transformed the world. Maybe irrevocably, though that's an open question, and maybe for good and maybe for ill. One has to think that through. All goods come with some evils, too. So he's the most influential thinker. And this probably sounds odd, but he's also the inventor of modern natural science. So we like to think, without studying, we like to think that, well, there's just this evolution in scientific innovations. First there was the bow and arrow 10,000 years ago, and now we have nuclear weapons and all of the other fruits of nuclear power. Isn't that just some, consistently evolving cycle? And the answer is absolutely not. That's the cartoon view. The truth is that there was almost no scientific progress for, 10,000 years. And then an enormous amount very quickly in the span of 200, 300, 400 years. And Descartes is the root cause of that. He invented what we call science, what we have in mind when we say science. The ancients, of course, by the ancients, I mean the Greeks and the Romans, they also had a science. They had a word for science, but they meant something entirely different. They did not mean the application of rules in order to torture nature so that it would unleash its secrets. And then we can use those secrets in order to make things that are strong, powerful, and serve us. They didn't have that view whatsoever. They were aware of that view, and they thought that it was a bad view. It was an error to go in that direction. Aristotle makes that very clear. Plato makes that very clear. They knew about this. In fact, Aristotle talks about looms learning to weave themselves as a concrete example of what mechanical arts could do, or tripods hopping of their own accord, so robotics. Totally aware of this alternative and didn't dismiss it flippantly, but said this would be bad for human beings. We should not go down that path. So there was a point of origin for modern natural science. It was indeed invented as we understand it. It was, you could say, invented in a certain way by Machiavelli, who launched the idea of what it would look like, but the concrete science that we have now was created by Descartes and Sir Francis Bacon, who was just 20 years older than him, but I think Descartes was more influential at the end. Now, there are, however, and this is the element that is constantly left out today, because we think that science just circulates of its own accord and it evolves, and we should just accept it. We should just, whatever comes out of it, we should just accept. It's a runaway train, and we have no choice but to stay on it. But there are philosophic and moral arguments beneath the creation of science, which are almost never touched on today, and which is really the core of what is interesting about this. And I would say that these arguments are above science. These arguments are arguments that science on its own terms cannot comprehend. And in this way, I think that some of these arguments, and that'll be the core of what we talk about, are the real thing beneath science, whereas science is a kind of front for these arguments. The powers that you will enjoy, the utility that you'll get out of innovations, they hide the real philosophic arguments that we're going to discuss. So we also think we have this bad habit of believing that just like science just evolves, that big major things actually happen because of vast political movements or protests or vague changes in ideas that we can't really get at, that are obscure. But the truth is that these kinds of intellectual era-shattering and era-creating ideas are produced just by individuals, by small books that are then obscured. So we should correct that in our minds, that one person who is a genius can be much more influential than all of science, than all protest movements, than all, whatever else. So I want to prove to you how influential he's been, and Professor Holloway mentioned this. But there are a whole host of things that simply would not exist without Descartes. And this is the way to prove to those who may have never read him, may have never heard of him, of how influential he has been. None of the fruits of modern science, medicine, for example, would exist without him. Has anybody here met anybody that had, leprosy, plague, smallpox? We don't even think about it. It's just been eradicated. And this would not have been possible without Descartes. There's also a very important psychological element in this too. And we'll get into this in a bit, but the core of it is this, that the psychological transformation which Descartes is after, that takes place when you believe in science or you believe in something else. So for example, when we get sick, and it looks like we may be dying, do we turn to prayers or do we turn to medicine? Do we immediately start shopping around doctors, going from sometimes city to city, looking for the best specialist? You know, we've come to believe, and in a way it's true, that science will save us and that therefore it is the kind of life-giving authority over us. It controls our fears and hopes in a way that in a previous era, God did. And it may seem silly to even pose that question. When you get sick, who do you turn to? God, prayer, let's say, or medicine. But it just seems silly, but that question is not actually settled. We have the impression that it's settled for us, but it's far from settled. What about the surrounding things that show Descartes' immense influence? All of the flying machines, the drilling machines, the swimming machines, the power and energy, all of this was possible because of this method that he created that would, as I said before, unlock the fruits of the fruitful powers hidden in material nature. And he gives a very good metaphor for it. He says that, you know, sand comes from glass. Excuse me, glass comes from sand. But it's a transformation of that body through heat that makes it possible. Similarly, with almost all things that science creates, we have just this raw nature, iron ore that's buried in the ground, uranium that's buried in the ground. There must be a work of art, so to speak, to transform, to break down, to process, to know how to unleash those powers. That is all the fruits of his thinking. And you see it in an even more broad context throughout the world. I mean, one could say, in a certain sense, that all of international politics today is really organized around these ideas in Descartes in the following sense, that what we really compete for are who has stronger, more capable fruits of modern natural science, both to create wealth and to create, you know, weapon systems or electricity or whatever. That's one of the core competitions. I mean, before Descartes, countries were not competing for oil, for example. You only need oil if you can generate, you know, power through it. So all of modern international politics, in a way, has this undercurrent of Cartesian thinking. So those are the external things that are obvious about his influence. What about the less apparent? I've kind of given you a clue about this already. One of them is that the view that that nature has no purpose and no end, material nature, and can be used for our own utility, our powers, our strength, to strengthen ourselves. That is a very modern view that originates in him, and there are a great deal of implications to it, moral implications, moral standards. For instance, our view is, roughly speaking, with some ambiguity, but roughly speaking, that the highest human good is health. That we're a body, that body should endure, it should go on, and that's one of the cores of human life. It's one of the cores of our entire immense scientific apparatus, to save bodies from dying. And this is a very new view that we think is like natural and commonsensical. Well, of course you don't want to die. You want to preserve your body forever. But there were previous eras that had just as plausible opinions about that kind of end of human life. And they would have said that, well, number one, why do you want to preserve a wretched little life? That's totally against what we think. You're not excellent. You're a mediocrity. That life is worthless to you, actually. The ancients thought this way. That era, that view can come back. And in fact, something like that can probably will come back. Against, I need to preserve my body forever, no matter how unhappy I am. And in this regard, he influences our imagination. These moral views that come out of science influence our imagination because they influence how we think about ourselves and what the goods of life are. And in the American context, the great thinker, Alexis de Tocqueville, have you guys heard of him? Read him? Yeah. Oh, excellent. That's a lot of people. Do you guys remember what he says at the beginning of part 2 of Democracy in America? He says that Americans are an odd people because they are the people that have most been influenced by Descartes and have read him least. It's an amazingly profound observation. And in a certain way, the whole of volume 2 of Democracy in America, that great masterwork, is actually an explanation, a very subtle explanation of the meaning of that. And to save you the years of pain of reading it and trying to understand it, the basic point for us is that Descartes has this bizarre, quiet influence. We don't even know about him, but he governs our minds, he directs our lives, and we're influenced by the science that he created. And we're not even aware of it, the silent, immense influence. So I want to try and, that's just by way of explaining how influential and important of a thinker he is. But I want to try and discuss a little bit this particular book and some of the details in it to work out how this influence was brought about, how he understands himself to be acting so as to bring about this influence. Now, I would say that, as I said before, this is a revolutionary book, immensely influential in its own time. It was published anonymously, so nobody knew who wrote it for a very long time. And it has an intention. Now, when we think of philosophers, we don't think of them as having intentions, because we have a very domesticated and university-like view of what philosophers are. We think that they're like, monkish scribblers, or sometimes they're portrayed like madmen, deeply unhappy, that nobody understands them or something like that. That is just such a grotesque caricature of what philosophy is. These are actually the most clear-minded, rational, confident human beings around, that don't show off their confidence. And in reality, they think of themselves correctly as world forming, creating new epochs, creating new worlds out of old worlds. But neither are they, in that regard, just looking for the truth. They never present actually, finally, at bottom, in any clear way, what they really think. They never just say, and here's what the truth is. They say, well, the truth is a little this, a little that, but you have to read these books very carefully over years to elicit what they really think. It's very difficult to get at. And in this way, in the way of having a political project, this book is meant to replace the old books. It's meant to replace Aristotle, and it's meant to replace the Bible. This, for Descartes, as he thinks of himself, this is a new Bible for a new human being and a new world that will be transformed by science. Now, the book is written as a fable. He even calls it a fable. Is a fable true or false? Isn't it implied that a fable is false? But he calls it a fable because he wants to develop what it meant for a real philosopher's mind to come into its own. And so he wants to give other people that are reading it an image to imitate and a political project to follow. So what really is the core of this driving argument, this revolutionary thing that he created? So my argument is that it's the method. He calls it a method. And I think we can roughly call it the scientific method. Here's how he describes it. It's very simple. It only has 4 rules, and it's made to be for every man, he says. So not for geniuses. He himself doesn't use the method, but it's for others to follow in his footsteps. And here's the method. You guys will recognize it. Number 1, accept as true only what is evidently true. Okay, you need evidence, not an imagination, not an imagining of it, not a theory, not a hypothesis, not an indirect proof, but evidence, direct evidence. And evidence, as we'll see in a moment, means material evidence. Step 2, divide every difficulty into as many parts as is possible and necessary. So going deeper and deeper to molecules, atoms. 3, begin with the simplest objects and thus the ones easiest to know. And 4th, make thorough enumerations in order to avoid leaving things out. Okay, that's the method. Seems very simple. It seems like something that we could just digest, memorize, use in our daily life, and we have, as I'm arguing. But I want to jump into why he even created this thing at all. That's the real driving argument. Why do you need a method? Why do you need to reshape this coming epoch that he wants to shape through this method? That's what's at stake. And I think that there are a couple of answers. Here's one way that he argues that we have to interpret. He says that, look at a city, look at a big, beautiful city like Rome, and you'll see that that city has been growing for 2,000 years. It was first a village, it then became a town, and then it became a great empire. The problem is that that city has gone through different eras, and there wasn't one single architect using, as he says, his will and reason to design it. And there's a problem there because that city is imperfect. Okay, that's what he says. It takes him a paragraph to say that. But what does this mean? What's he talking about? It's a metaphor for something else. And it's a metaphor for the ages through which, let's say, Western humanity has gone. It was savage and barbarous. That's the village. It then became classical. That's the city. And then it became Christian. And all of the ideas that those different eras created are all jumbled up and confused and must be disentangled, or let's say not even disentangled, in a certain sense, wiped away. He says in a different part of his book that you cannot cause a revolution like Luther did, which divides Europe and creates a war for a long time. Can't do that. You go directly against something, you get blowback. But you can go, as Machiavelli says, around the minds of men so as to clarify things and get rid of them. And that's what the method will serve to do. So everything in the world, he says, is mixed up because it has not been ordered by a single mind using reason. And that's obviously, beneath that is his critique of the Christian God. He thinks that he did not order with regard to reason. There were errors. So what does this mean? So that's the painting of the world. Now the method will clear some of that brush away, and it'll brush away if it is deployed against the current political, moral, religious authorities. And here's his general critique of that and how this method's going to change. He says that the current authorities have an incorrect form of reasoning called probable reasoning. That's a word that he makes up. I mean, it's a kind of cheeky way of putting things. In reality, it's not reasoning itself. It's just pride and vanity and superstition. And it's a real mixture because they mindlessly inherited the city that was just developed by chance, that was part ancient, part barbarous, part Christian. But for Descartes, probable reasoning does not lead to real productivity. And an example of that is, if you guys read this, we don't even read this stuff anymore unless you're in a couple of universities, but there were like 1,000 years, 600 years, where the definition of motion was being disputed, or the definition of the soul or the definition of an angel was being disputed. Generation after generation, this is from Descartes' perspective, never making any progress, never creating anything that's demonstrative, always just probabilistic, imaginative reasoning, spending generations doing this. And there were powerful institutions, obviously, that housed the people that controlled reason in this way. But the problem is, as he says, that, that when you have institutions that are undisciplined, i.e., everybody there is free to just reason on their own, you just end up having this kind of competition for who can be more and more obscure for 600 years. And nobody ever checks them or tests them. This is why he says a famous comment in this book. He says that often a common man will have more common sense than these people. And the reason for that is because, if you're like buying stocks and you're wrong, you will be punished. You will go broke. If you're, a farmer planting seeds and you misread something, the quality of your seeds or whatever it is, you will be punished. Whereas here, reason goes unchecked, and it's driven by pride, the belief that the more obscure things are, the more interesting they are. And what will discipline this? A method. They will be forced. That entire apparatus of this kind of reasoning will be forced to prove itself through a method. So the problem is that this is a deeper human problem, that human reason is not actually disciplined by nature. It flies off on its own, and it needs this work of art, a method, which is a work of art of his mind, to discipline it. What kind of reasoning does he want then? I said it's demonstrative reasoning. So this book was published, it's a short book, but at the end of it, it's not printed in this edition that I have, are 3 appendices. And those appendices are, 4 times longer than the book itself. And they are on optics, meteorology, and geometry. So he's showing off the fruits of this method for the first time. Do we have, 5 generations of argumentations about optics? No, it's pretty clear. The geometry of optics is pretty clear at this point. You move on, you progress further. You don't get, when you have reasoning that is only subjected to these rules of the method, you have resolutions. It's demonstrated to work, it's demonstrated to not work. You move on. You will never have 20 generations of disputations about the definition of motion. And bad science, things that cannot demonstrate themselves, go away. It's just called quackery, fraud, error, whatever it is, but it just goes away. It doesn't stay corrosively in a society. So the method will tame this natural tendency of reason. That's the first reason why we need a method. The second one gets a bit more complicated. It's very interesting. It has to do with the natural imperfections of human beings. And here's the basic argument. So we are all born children. You guys have children? Well, there's your child, I take it. Okay, well, when you have a child, I have 3 kids. You see that they're born small, weak, ignorant. It's just what nature does. Doesn't mean you don't love them, but that's just what they are. And the problem for Descartes is that their reason begins to bloom far after their bodies grow. And in that span of time, there are all sorts of authorities that take hold of their reason. The authorities of, as he says, teachers, and that's a very broad term, voluminous. It means parents, it means priests, it means the society in general, to take hold of that child's opinions about itself, about good and evil. And then the second authority that we're governed by, because reason comes in only so late, is our appetites, our natural desires that are extremely difficult to check. For most people, almost impossible to finally check and overcome, even though they can be, managed in kind of law-abiding ways. And so the problem is that these teachers of opinions already inform the being at such an early age, so that when you're really reasoning with clarity, let's say 12, 13, 14, in a way you're cooked from his perspective, already governed. And so you begin to see what this method will do for us. It will take a child, he says this later on in a very subtle way, he says, you take one unruly child who is totally formed by conventional opinions and appetites. And then he says, and here's another child, says it in one sentence, who's sitting quietly doing mathematics. So that child has been subordinated to a new authority, and adult, I mean, it's not just about, children, will be subordinated to this new authority. And why do this? Well, he says, remember we talked about the city, that it grows, it's not perfect, it wasn't the design of one single genius. He says, but there's one exception. And that exception is Sparta. You guys heard of Sparta? It's a very famous ancient city. He doesn't even mean, like, when you start really developing a taste for these philosophers, they don't really mean often what they say. It's not that he thought that Sparta was precisely this, but he's going to use it as an example anyways to elaborate a possibility that we may not have thought of. He says that Sparta is the only city that was created not by nature, just growing, not by chance, where different eras, different opinions mishmash together and becomes this soup, but rather it comes from one single human intellect and will, and that's its founder, Lycurgus. And so he's tipping his hat there in what he's doing as well. He's going to be a modern Lycurgus that creates this modern imaginary city that will actually be coherent, where one's opinions and appetites will cohere, and one will be subordinated to a real authority, which is the science, its method. This makes sense so far? Yeah, okay, good. So the goal, again, to finish this part, the goal is to bring our appetites and opinions into a coherent order. And you need this work of art to do that. Because our problem is, our tendency is to create, this is his quote, to conceive plans beyond our powers. Quite a mysterious, vague phrase that you'd have to interpret. That's our problem. Our imagination and our desires drive us to wanting impossible things. And that tendency in us, which is given to us by nature, has to be managed, or let's say subjected to reason. Okay, this makes sense? So I want to turn to the method itself and describe a little bit about how it'll work in psychological terms. Because again, we understand the method. We know this word, we have methodologies and all the things that we do, especially when you're an academic. We know what the scientific method is broadly. But what I want to get to are the specific psychological impacts of the method. Because as I've tried to show you, that's what's really at stake. That's what he's really trying to do. Tame, control, manage, improve also these tendencies in our natures, which are simply given to us by, in his opinion, by an indifferent nature or a cruel God. It's not clear where he falls on that, but one or the other that needs to be correct. So here is rule one. I read it to you before. I want to summarize it now with detail. So first is, accept as true only what is evidently true, namely what presents itself to the mind clearly and distinctly. So what does that mean? What are the implications of that psychologically? Well, one, it means no reliance on authorities outside of one's own reason. So no tradition and no scripture. That's a very important one, that is made to flatter you and to tell you that your reason alone can get at the truth, or whatever, and to therefore inflate your pride in a different way than we discussed before, so as to shove off all of the other authorities that have been given to you. So it rigs the game. And it flatters you because it tells you that in principle, you as an individual are capable of reasoning about all things. In other words, no prophets with exclusive access to mysteries, to mystical, mysterious teachings. And I think that broadly speaking, going back to the comment about Tocqueville, we do have this tendency as Americans. We do, like when we have big philosophic questions, or for that matter, in day-to-day life, we don't say, well, what does the tradition say? What do the priests say? What do the rabbis say? What do the philosophers say? We never say those things to ourselves. We just think, no, I can think this through on my own, and we go with that. Second, the second rule, divide every difficulty into as many parts as is possible and necessary. In other words, this is the radical part. In other words, the mind will impose an order onto the world. So just as an example, this may make us, uncomfortable, but, if you take out, if you take a human being and line up all the human components onto, a board, onto, whatever, bones, nerves, brain, organs, you would say that that's not a human being anymore. That's components of a human being. But science can't tell you that together those components form a whole, and that the whole is natural and good. So when you take apart components, like we did here, or think of any natural element, getting down to molecules and atoms, you immediately assume, without thinking about it, that there is not a natural order that has assembled that thing in that way, and that it is good that it is that way. You can disassemble anything, put it back together, improve it. So that's the second rule. The third rule, it deals with the order of thinking, of our thinking. And he says, begin with the simplest objects, and thus the ones easiest to know. And then you ascend to the most composite. So you begin with the smallest, and then you ascend. And here again is the psychological, it's not fair to call it a trick, but the psychological habit being formed by that is that when you begin with the simplest means you're taming the imagination. The mind must proceed rationally and not fantastically. You cannot, in other words, start with God, as the entirety of the tradition did. You have to root it in all of your analysis in something material that you can touch, feel, or can have a tool so that you can effectively see it, like a microscope. You don't start with the highest, you start with the smallest and most simple. And fourth, is making thorough enumerations and surveys in order to avoid leaving things out. So thoroughness of this kind points to two things. One's enthusiasms or hopes, hope in finding something, hope in discovering something, must be subordinated to the method. And thoroughness also means generations of new worker bees, i.e. scientists, will work together in unison, but separately, to make thorough enumerations of all material things. So in other words, the project, the thoroughness component means that, I'll give you an example. My uncle was a physicist who worked in ionospheric physics. And there were such scientists in let's say in 20 different countries, all working on the same problems, trying in a way to outcompete each other, working from the same givens, going through the same enumerations to see who could make progress first. And that took generations. He died recently, so at the time of his death, the science, the understanding of his specific world of science was here. 3 generations ago, it was here. But it was all being, as I said, as he says, enumerated in each generation to build up to the next generation. And he thinks that the whole world and all of its relationships can be recategorized when you subordinate yourself to this method. And it culminates in the discovery of laws of nature. So the ancients had no laws of nature. They didn't think such laws existed. And in a way, Descartes doesn't think that they exist either, except for in one sense, that once you discover something that is like gravitational pull, you discover it for the sake of harnessing it and mastering it. So in other words, you take as given something like gravitational pull, you can mathematize the direction of a projectile, the force required to deliver it there. And so what you're doing is you're subordinating yourself to that law, but in subordinating yourself, You're using it so as to get what you want. That is the psychology that he wants replicated, to find these laws, to subordinate ourselves to them so as to make them useful to us. Let me just finish and open it up to questions on the following note. I mentioned this to you guys before, he thinks of himself as a kind of more prudent Luther. Luther wanted to take down the old authorities. He created a war that lasted for a very long time, caused massive destruction, and created a division in the world that still to this day exists, less and less prominently in America, but it existed for hundreds of years, Protestants and Catholics. Descartes says that that was imprudent and an error. He went directly into the flames. He should have done something like what Descartes does, which is the creation of this new habit of mind, a new custom, as he says, so as to create a new universalized and homogeneous way of operating the mind that basically erases over time the old city that is this incoherent mixture of all of these concepts that can't just be disentangled, but has to be erased slowly. And as one scholar, guy named Joseph Cropsey put it, it is clear that Descartes expected his project, hence his thought and his reason, to live on in the minds and lives of untold generations. In this way, perhaps his rational soul lives on and on, long surviving his own extinction. Is that a nice quote? Yeah. And it lives again through this method. One last word, I should say, and then we'll open it up. I described to you in very bold and broad terms, broad strokes, his project. Just because it succeeded doesn't mean that it's true. It has succeeded massively. As I said, all of world national competitions are really about who controls the tools and the progress of science. Our minds are modeled on these methods to the extent that we exclude other possibilities of truth or knowledge outside of his categories. But that doesn't mean it's true. Sir Francis Bacon, his predecessor, has a very beautiful metaphor of a river that he says it's actually the false and bloated things that float on top of a river, the river being, the generations. And it's the weighty and profound things that sink to the bottom that are discovered by only a few people. So just because it's succeeded to the extent that it has, doesn't mean that it's true. Many false things have succeeded. And I think that where philosophy is today, like serious philosophy, not like, just typical kind of academic show-off philosophy, is to try and rediscover the world that Descartes destroyed. Because he destroyed it for political reasons. He destroyed it for useful reasons. He wanted science to benefit humanity. But that doesn't mean at the end of the day that Plato and Aristotle, just to use them as an example, are wrong. They may have truer insights, a truer articulation of the world, or religion too, than Descartes. And I think that the rediscovery of serious philosophy is actually what the next era will likely be about in the study of philosophy. So thanks very much, guys. Questions? Yeah.
So as you know, our
yeah.
In my mind, politics is humanities. So I find that kind of strange.
Yeah.
When I think about the Tocqueville, Samuel Huntington, Francis Fukuyama, they have long-lasting, relevant work based nothing to do with science, but on opinion.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
Mill.
Yeah.
On liberty. This is opinion, right?
Right.
However, it's so influential, whereas
Yeah.
the science part, statistics, adding that to political science is important. For you to do that with any field, how do you think science is negatively influencing the study of politics?
Yeah, it's a great question, for a variety of reasons. I mean, look, just to use this vulgar example, I mean, the sciences are always better funded in universities than the social sciences. And everybody knows that, and everybody knows that there's a reason for that, which is that the sciences are harder and they yield something actual. You know, they benefit more people, though that's not the standard, but they do benefit more people, and they're more rigorous. Everybody kind of knows that. Nobody wants to mention it. And what you end up having is that the social sciences often just produce kind of commonsensical things that we already knew. It doesn't have the character of, you know, a penetrating science, like unlocking the laws of nature, for example, unlocking, you know, the energies in uranium, which is, you know, kind of a magnificent thing. Wherever you might side on the scientific project, good or bad, but like that is a magnificent thing. And the reason that the social sciences have that rap, and they should, is because they try to be like science in imposing this method onto human beings. Replicability. The problem is that human beings end up being, I think Descartes is kind of right, not totally, but kind of right about our natures, that we're part opinions, especially opinions about justice, part hopes that originate from our bodies and inform our minds. And it's very difficult to scientifically understand that. It's not the right method to use. The right method is literature or philosophy. And I mentioned this earlier, you know, Descartes doesn't need, he doesn't have the method to get to the method, to invent the method. There's all sorts of philosophic, psychological analysis that is prior to the method. And that is a closer analysis to what human beings actually are, how they behave, on what grounds, that can't be measured by method. And I think that it's actually a very bad thing that we have, you know, politics as a science, because it excludes, I mean, you know, you take an opinion poll, for example, and, you know, you look at opinions on a bell curve, and the outliers often are both the dumbest and the smartest. And where the smartest exists is much more interesting than the average. That is not trained, that doesn't have prudence, that, you know, doesn't have a flavor for understanding human beings, doesn't understand the regime, its motions, where it's going, where it came from, the good and evil for it. Tocqueville, for example, on an opinion poll would just be dismissed as an outlier, you know? So this is our habitual attempt to make everything scientific without much success. It just keeps getting funded and funded because of inertia, because this is a very wealthy country that doesn't know what to do with its money. So, you know, it does those things. But yeah, I don't think that in whatever the next era will look like, it will probably have science, and it probably won't have, you know, social science. Political science. There will be politics, obviously, but it'll be more the study of human beings and regimes, and less, you know, measuring yardstick measurements. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I'm thinking about a comment that I heard when I was very young. Part of that is famous before this. There is no such thing as society.
No such thing as
Society.
society.
That seems to me to be a very Cartesian idea.
Did she mean that in earnest or as a critique?
It was more of a libertarian.
Yeah.
But,
Right.
I'm also thinking about one of the critiques I've read about Descartes, he ignored the role of emotion.
Emotion.
Yeah. Can you speak to kind of like those two parallel comments and questions?
Yeah.
Is the idea of the lady Thatcher comment, do you think that's a Cartesian comment? And would you agree that one of the Descartes' big errors is the ignoring of the role of messiness and emotion?
Yeah. All right. Let me start with the second question. No, I think that that's incorrect. He has a book called The Passions of the Soul, which is, this book is read in most undergrad, survey classes, philosophy survey classes. Passions of the Soul is not studied anymore, but it was actually more influential than this book in its time. And there he basically does a species of what your question was, which is what he's interested in is psychophysical behavior. And it's called the passion, so the emotions. And he says that his biggest critique of the ancients is that they didn't understand the nature of the passions. And what they misunderstood specifically was that there is a psychophysical, biological force within us that is really the cause of our passions. And he says that going along with the scheme that I've given you guys today, he says that this is just an error of nature, that that our own bodies, as they affect our minds, are out of our control, or so we thought, or so the ancients thought, which is why they invented all of these stoic regimens of just ignore the passions, obscure them through various dogmas. But the truth is that medication can help. Medication that will understand on the biological level how to reduce those, he calls them forces, within us that cause certain emotions or passions. So he is very specific about that. And there I think he's probably most wrong in terms of the effects that he brought about. But it was a very serious consideration of his in terms of the very concrete way that science could help human beings. And look, there is some truth to it. There's a great deal of moral ambiguity, but just hear me out. I mean, a huge amount of the American population is on, various psychopharmacological medications. And Descartes would say, well, that's not so bad. That's not so bad. I'm not defending Descartes. I'm just elaborating what I think he would say. That's not so bad because that person, through no fault of his own, let's say, whether through habituation or experiences or just this natural problem in us, that there are these forces in us that affect our minds, we can bring about a calm in him to make those passions subside. I mean, he's really the inventor of this psychopharmacological industry. So that's number one. Number two, on the libertarianism versus a society. I mean, I think that it's, people do say that, and smart people say that, but smart people can be wrong too. And I think that it's a delusion because, first of all, there's no such thing as, a society truly of individuals, actually independent of one another. It just has never existed. People are born into families. They have, little villages. Those things exert an authority onto you, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill, but let's say for good. It makes you more, let's say, decent, honest. It makes you capable of love and attachment. I just don't think that human beings like that exist. And I think that the kind of the intellectual scene for, let's say, 60 years has tried to argue that position unpersuasively and unsuccessfully, because when you say that, you thereby get away from thinking about well, how should the society look? And what are your obligations to it? And what are its obligations to you? I think that none of the founders, just to use this example, were libertarian. They were libertarian in some regards, but that narrative has been usurped. And I think that they did want some individualism and individual rights, but then again, a whole that fits together too. So. Of course.
So this is a simple one, and maybe even a simple-minded one, my specialty. And it could be easy to answer, or it could be really hard.
Okay.
But the comparison with the ancients, is very fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Is it possible to summarize in a few words the difference between what Socrates thought he was doing when he philosophized versus what Descartes thinks he's doing when he's philosophizing, or when they're trying to understand nature?
Yeah. And do you mean, I mean, this is the, just to clarify, this is the most difficult question available. Look, Socrates is after first causes. So the causes of things. And it's very difficult to get at that directly. Maybe it's impossible, but you can have enough evidence so that your mind is persuaded enough so that you're not merely skeptical of everything, and enough that you're not simply dogmatic and willful. Okay, so what does that mean? I can take you through, let's see, what's the best argument to take you through? All right, here's an argument. So, you know, you are born of, everybody here was born of a woman, and you were replicated. You are in a certain way a replication of that woman. And so that woman, your mother's, did not give birth to a frog or a dog. In fact, that never happens. It seems. Maybe it's possible that it could happen. I think that's Socrates' position, that it is actually possible. But it would have to have some force, some divine force. So you see, nature replicates itself. Okay, and then you ask yourself, well, what are the material causes that nature replicates itself? And then you quickly see that, well, material causes are actually not enough, because there is a cause inside of matter that is a governing cause, but it can only be hypothesized, and that is form. And so forms somehow oversee, govern, create matter, and cannot be proven, but they must exist. And then you build out from what a human being is to the whole. Does the whole have a form? If it does, what is the cause of that form? And then you get into these questions of like, well, is the cause chance? Is that even possible for chance to create an order? Next level, is it divine? Okay, now that seems more plausible. But what characteristics would that divine have to possess so that it could create? And then you get into all of these contradictions about how a divine cannot create, but must be, as Aristotle says, basically thinking, a thing thinking itself, a being that has no creative power. And then you're stuck. And that is something like what the Socratic position is in very broad strokes. And that Socrates would call science. That is science. Science means universal, unalterable knowledge. And that's the only knowledge he thinks that is available to us. Descartes totally disagrees with that. He would say that those are interesting questions. You can never solve them. And it's not enough to just say, well, like, you know, I'm content with the limited knowledge that is accessible to me. He says, quite to the contrary, that since those questions are unanswerable, there are certain benefits that we can bring to human beings to make their lives more comfortable, more powerful, more at ease in their bones. And something that can transform the world away from the ignorance in which it lives. And so science is a tool to do those things. Descartes does not think that the discoveries of science are true in the deepest fundamental sense. Like, he does think that, you know, I mean, like the smallest component of a material body that you can see through a microscope, he doesn't deny that that exists. It's just an irrelevant truth. And it's not even true. You can go deeper and deeper. It's just the tools that limit you from seeing, or further and further out. The core is not what you can observe. The core is this set of views that says that science as a whole is true insofar as it is a true benefit to us. That's a very big, broad answer, but like, look, you can write a book on that topic. And every sentence I said has to be, you know, threaded out to really argue for those points. But that's, I think, the broad view. There's a fundamental disagreement between the ancient world and the modern world as to what is the content of philosophy. That's the core disagreement. And it's a serious one that has created all of this. And as I said before, even if it seems like we have all of these powers, nuclear energy, et cetera, battery energy, which is, kind of an amazing thing. Just because those things exist, it does not at all mean that Descartes in the fundamental sense is right. That what he says is fundamentally true. And it may be the case that that broad brushstroke of what Socratic philosophy looks like actually gets at the truth much more.